Welcome, folks. This webinar's topic was Agile Reconstruction. And the question was, do you need one? And I'll let you be the judge of that. I think in some cases, for some of us, it may be something that's long overdue, and in others, maybe not so much. But with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. So, first, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Tom Perry, and I'm a local Seattle transformation consultant and coach. I'm also the author of The Little Book of Impediments, the founder of Agile Management Northwest, a co-founder of Five Whys, and I'm the founder of Thomas Perry LLC. These days, I'm a little bit of a Sherpa, a little bit of a builder, maybe builder with a lowercase b, and an innovator. So I spend some time building things like boats or businesses or you name it. That seems to be my theme for the week is building things, even if it's only humble Legos. Welcome. So to our topic today, we're going to cover basically three things. How we get to the point of needing to do reconstruction of some point, which really suggests that there's some sort of failure involved. So we'll talk about failure first. Then we'll talk about what Agile reconstruction might look like. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on the topic. So this can be a dialogue. We don't have to just take my word for it. I'm curious what you think as well, and then where we go from there. So with that in mind, we'll jump right in. So when you stop and think about it, of course, Agile transformations failing is not particularly new. We've had project management failures, according to the Standish or the Chaos Report. We've been failing at those things for a long time, but now we no longer call them projects. These days, it's an Agile transformation, and an Agile transformation has a lot going on in it. And there are probably a lot of good examples of transformations that have failed. So I can think of one in recent memory that I was involved in, which was at GE Transportation. And the reason it failed wasn't so much because the transformation itself was doing anything wrong. I think there were a lot of good things happening, but the company was going out of business. It was really too little, too late. And so that was and so at the end of the day, they ended up canceling the engagement, and pretty much everyone was shortly afterwards laid off. Do folks have examples of other Agile transformation failures?
I don't have anything specific in terms of, or I don't necessarily want to call out any specific companies because
Well,
most
that's
of them still
true.
exist.
You got to be careful about that.
Yeah, but one of the patterns that I do see is a lot of times is when you've got transformations kind of starting organically, and you really don't have that leadership support, and all
Yeah.
you're doing is thrashing, and it's just a tug of war between leadership and the teams who are trying to actually do the right things.
Mm-hmm. And really, it's there are a lot of transformations that don't necessarily, I would say, do anything dramatic in terms of failing. They just perhaps don't live up to their promise. There are a lot of transformations. I did a small transformation for a company in New England about 3 years ago. It was my first safe transformation. We did everything fine. Folks started adopting Scrum, and they started using Safe, and everybody was happy. But it never really led to meaningful, significant change, and in the way that you could measure. In other words, if you went and looked at the company's bottom line, yeah, they're all doing Safe, but they didn't make a dime because of it. Are the people happier because of it? Some were, and some weren't. So it really was pretty lackluster at the end of the day. And that, in some ways, is almost worse than a failure. In some ways, I would almost rather have an outright spectacular failure where the executives say, we're done with this. We never want to do that again. That was a total mistake. Instead, it's we transformed to Agile and it really didn't make a difference. So, one of the things that I think we see, there are a lot of failure modes, and you're probably familiar with some of these. Perhaps one of the most prevalent is simply the culture doesn't support the change. And I think you were alluding to that, Rob. And I've certainly seen cases where uh, you go in, you do a transformation, and they just don't have the kind of culture that's really well suited to agile development to begin with. And it's very unlikely they're going to be successful with it. And that's a very, very difficult place to start from. Another example is where the executives are just sort of signing the check to get this out of the way. And that would certainly be the case of that company in New England I was working at, where they were signing the check, okay, great. If it's 100 grand to implement SAFe, we're going to spend 100 grand. We're going to get a coach in here. We're going to do the thing. And then nobody can gripe that we didn't make the investment because I signed on the check right here. And there have certainly been plenty of cases of that as well. But were the executives really bought in? Were they really committed to change and transformation? Not in any substantive way. It was more like they were signing the checks and going through the motions. And even in the cases where they're not doing those things, perhaps they are willing and engaged. Oftentimes, what they find out as they get into their transformation is that they are buried in technical debt. And so I've been involved in more than one where they realized that they had such a significant issue with technical debt that there was almost no way they could crawl out of the hole. The kind of investment it was going to take would pretty much cost them the company. And these, there are still an embarrassing number of companies out there that are, working with mainframe, COBOL code, that is beyond antique. That in fact they no longer have people around who even know how the code works. And for those cases, they're almost dead on arrival. You can sell them an agile transformation, but as soon as they hit the technical debt wall, they're dead. And sometimes you have the executives who start with the checkbook transformation or the culture that really doesn't blend well with agile values, and those folks will revert back to the traditional approach. And in some ways, perhaps that's for the best. You make the transformation to agile, or you start to, and they realize, no, this really isn't us. And so when that happens, again, that's one of those situations where we find ourselves making the move, trying to make a transformation to agile, and then failing or falling back at some point because either the executive team lacks the will, or even recognizes that they're just not ready yet. And there are probably lots of other reasons, all good, why transformations fail. Are there any others that come to mind for folks?
Yeah, Tom. I was part of one for about a year and a half here locally. For I won't name names, but
Uh-huh.
kind of along the lines of the culture, the leadership really didn't get the kind of middle management on board, the functional managers.
Yep.
So right off the bat, the functional managers were kind of subversively, undermining the whole thing.
Yeah.
pulling people on and off teams willy-nilly, and that was a big problem.
Yeah, that is super common where you may have the leadership team on board, you
Yeah,
may have the people who are working on the development teams themselves very much on board. Let's go.
right.
But the frozen middle can
Yep.
kill a lot of these engagements.
Yeah, that's
And
exactly what happened.
yeah,
I think had they thought about that up front and done some work up front to manage the middle,
hmm
help them understand where they fit, how they play in, it might have
yeah.
come out different.
Well, and they're oftentimes the ones who are caught in the crunch in the middle.
Yeah,
So they're under pressure, and if leadership doesn't give them some sort of relief valve, or some leadership that gives them an out, then you put them in an impossible position.
they're afraid they're going to lose their job, so then they protect it, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Which I
And
think
go
goes to
ahead.
one of the other things, which is that leadership has not really stated the why. Go agile, but why? And then have
Yeah,
all the goals surrounding that, so that that middle tier doesn't feel pressure to deliver. Instead, they have pressure to transform, to
yeah,
become something different.
yeah.
The upper leadership just hasn't. They don't understand the why, therefore they don't follow through.
I agree. I think what the not understanding why you're getting into a transformation is super common. It happens all the time, and it's also super important. If you don't, then you're very likely. I mean, it's got to be one of those number one reasons that failure can happen. And the other is that I think they closely related to that. They have no idea what the outcome is. In other words, there's no metrics that are agreed upon. There is no even crude set of benchmarks that says we know what good looks like, or we know what we hope to get out of this. And so both the metrics and the why, and maybe even using the term metrics is a little dangerous, but for without a doubt, not
But you
understanding why you're getting into it is a killer.
start with why.
That's right, Simon Sinek. So lots of reasons why transformations can stall, lots of reasons why transformations can sort of go nowhere and peter out. So it doesn't have to be necessarily some sort of cataclysmic event. And in fact, what we see in the industry is oftentimes a set of recycled transformations where somebody goes, and I can give one example because I've never worked for them and I'm well aware of them, and that's Capital One. And Capital One has been going, I think they've gone through at least 4 different transformations now, in the last 10 years. And they just kind of continue to bring in another wave of consultants and sort of restart their transformation yet again. And so I wouldn't necessarily say that any of those transformations is necessarily a failure, but they are certainly sort of reinitializing or rebooting or resetting their transformation on a almost regular basis. So I threw together this top 10 list, and I'm curious what you think. Now, these are the top 10 signs that you might need a reset. One, no change in product market performance or status. So if there's been a transformation, and at the end of that transformation, your product is not making any more money or doing any better than it was beforehand, it's likely your transformation really hasn't done anything for you. The execs are absent. So if the leadership is absent, then whatever your transformation was is likely to need a reset. Uh, if the team is unable to change features, it's likely you're going to need to reset. If the team can't change their own process, regardless of what it is, I don't care if it's Scrum or Kanban or whatever, if the team feels like their feet are bolted to the floor, then it's likely you're going to need some sort of reset. If you do a transformation and the reporting hierarchy doesn't change, then I question whether or not you really changed anything at all. And if everyone keeps their jobs, if you go through a transformation, if you change the way the teams work to high performing teams from what was stagnating, low performing teams, and everyone still has their jobs, I would question whether or not anything has actually changed. If developers never meet the customer, that's an easy one. I throw compliance in there not because compliance is necessarily evil, but it's mostly evil. And new jobs, if there are no new jobs, or rather, if all that happens in a transformation is only new jobs are introduced, new roles are introduced, then very likely your transformation needs a reset. And if at the end of the day nothing has changed, if it's the same people in the same roles doing the same things after the transformation, then you need a reset. What do you think of this list?
Number three, when you say can't change features, is that a technical debt? I can't change them because it's.
I think originally what I was thinking was that they can't. I've actually worked with teams that really were sort of given the features and told make that, and really couldn't morph it or experiment with it. In other words, by the time it came to them, it was decided upon. That's the right feature. Full stop. Just build it and shut up.
Right. Here's the spec.
Yeah. I think the technical debt side of that is good. I mean, by good, I mean I think that's a great way to characterize it as another way of being a problem. So yeah, I think that's a nice way of putting it. I think technical debt could definitely cause that.
So what I'm kind of got an affinity for is number 5. Reporting doesn't change. It means the PMO hasn't changed. They're still looking at the iron triangle, not customer satisfaction, team satisfaction, quality, etc.
Yeah. No, it's true. It's true.
Oh, and that was kind of the problem, the one I was talking about earlier. You had functional managers that still controlled all of the resources and weren't part of the weren't part of the process either.
Right. So I can't tell you how many times I've gone through transformations where at the end of the day, the same people were doing exactly the same jobs. And so if that's the case, you really haven't changed anything at that point. You've given them new titles. They're no longer the portfolio manager. They're an agile portfolio manager or something like that, or some variation on that theme, but you haven't changed anything fundamental. And there is the notion in Scrum of abnormal sprint termination. And I suppose I don't suppose we necessarily need yet another term in our general transformations, but you could think of some of these things as abnormal transformation termination. So there was certainly a company here locally that prior to the pandemic, we were going through a transformation, and then within just a matter of days, the entire transformation was shut down and canceled effectively because of the pandemic. Bam, gone. So at the end of the day, did they do anything wrong? Did the consultants do anything wrong? Not necessarily. It was just the business circumstances completely sidetracked any further work on that, and they laid off nearly half their staff, and any conversation about transformation was postponed for the foreseeable future. And of course, one of the big complaints, and part of the thing that actually inspired me to start thinking about this, was that people that I was having casual conversations with were saying, look, I hate SAFe. SAFe is a terrible framework. It's doing terrible things to our business. People are adopting it blindly. These big companies are implementing SAFe, and it's creating this disastrous sort of hodgepodge of compliance and agility that is never going to work. And so my job at the end of the day, it's just going to create this wave because it's so popular, this wave of implementations that are garbage. Basically, that these people believe so strongly that SAFe is unwieldy and not useful, that they believe that it'll just sort of create this wave of maimed and dysfunctional companies that'll need our help afterwards. And I'm using SAFe as the example here, but I don't think it's limited to that, because my experience has been that at the end of the day, folks haven't really cared what the framework was. So you could use LESS or DAD or, rational unified process for that matter. And at the end of the day, the customers are just as unhappy. You can fail with any one of those, and there doesn't seem to be anything unique about SAFe that makes it more or less likely to fail than the others. So the big frameworks, I think, are kind of what inspired some of this conversation, in that they seem to be, at least to some people, creating a lot of waste in our business. Maybe it's just the consultants. I've worked for one of those big consulting houses. I worked for CA for about 3 or 4 years. And when you are part of the Death Star and you descend on one of these engagements, you have your senior advisor on the engagement, somebody who's one of the senior people. And then you have a variety of newbies who are the young consultants, who you farm out to, a dozen different teams. And you charge your customer hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars for these monster engagements where you come in with an army of 30 consultants. And some could say, and I think with some justification, that those sorts of consultant army-led engagements are responsible for an awful lot of failures. And I don't know that that's necessarily the cause of all the problems, because certainly there are some that do go very well, but there are also a fair number of those sorts of engagements that don't go anywhere and cost people a great deal of money. So those are some of the origins, I think, that lie behind why transformations fail. So now let's put ourselves in the position of being an organization that has, for one reason or another, decided that we want to give it a go again, that we want to try and rebuild or take another run at an Agile implementation. Some folks kind of refer to this as the Agile Reset. So we're going to take a step back, do a big retrospective, evaluate what's happened so far, maybe fix the things that weren't there the first time around, work with the executives to understand why they want to do this, work to establish a coherent vision, and then based on that, engage them in leading and rolling out the change. I think, based on some minimal research, there are different flavors of this concept of an Agile reset that are out there. So if you go and look, there are already people who are starting to make a business out of this. And they're doing it at 3 different levels. The team level is very common. So doing a Scrum reset is terminology that you can find all over the place. And Lord knows there are a lot of Scrum teams out there that need all the help and love that you can give them. Then there is the leadership level. So for those cases where the leadership isn't engaged, doing some sort of agile reset at the leadership level makes a lot of sense. And then there is that messy middle, that frozen middle, which I'm characterizing here as the division or the org, which is really dealing with middle management. And so that's kind of the way I think about the different resets that are available to us. I think the most important thing to do is to focus on the leadership. Getting them on board first is the most important thing to do. If you can't get them on board, you're just going to perpetuate that cycle of trying to roll out Agile, failing for one reason or another because you don't have the leadership engaged, and then it's on to the next consultant. The team reset is something that I think happens for lots of reasons that may or may not have anything to do with the transformation as a whole. So there are teams that will, through attrition, lose people, and those teams will start to struggle. And so doing some sort of reset can be helpful for them. Teams that are split or have new people added to them, again, they may need some sort of refresher. So there are lots of different reasons that teams can find themselves in this situation. There are, the basic practice here that I've used is to go in and start with some sort of retrospective with the team to identify the areas, the pain points that they are struggling with first. Because even if I, as an outsider, identify areas that they're having issues with, if they don't agree with me, I can't get anywhere. So the first thing I have to do is identify what their perceived problems are. Once I've established that, then I can get their okay to focus on training and helping them with the areas where they believe they have issues. So that can be very, very different subset of issues from what I'm seeing as an outsider. Then you do whatever training you need to do and coaching to help get them to a place where they can start functioning competently again, and then ongoing coaching as necessary. At the division and organization level, it's a much, much larger group of people. And so your typical transformation approach looks something like doing an assessment, getting set up, doing some training, launching teams one after another, and then running the teams in some sort of collaborative environment with big room planning or PI planning or something like that. The thing that I think is missing from this equation is that there needs to be a healthy amount of coaching. And if there were one thing that I would add to this right now, it would probably be much more aggressive coaching of the middle management team. The other idea that's come up more and more frequently in conversations I've had with folks is that, look, we tried to scale Agile. We rolled out SAFe, for example, and it failed. So obviously what we need to do is scaling is not the answer. We don't like scaling. Scaling is a problem, so we're going to descale. That in fact, what we need to do is remove processes. What we need to do is remove bureaucracy. And by doing that, somehow we can be more successful at our implementation than by trying to add things like SAFe does. And SAFe, Lord knows it throws everything but the kitchen sink at the problem. So the question here is descaling really a thing? I think folks who are advocates for less would probably say their solution is the descaling solution. However, my experience with that has been that it's just as complicated, if not more so, to embrace descaling than it is to embrace scaling. So it sounds easier. There are fewer things. It ought to be simpler. But the fact of the matter is, you end up rolling your own at that point. That you end up rolling your own process, making your own process, and that can be just as complicated. Um, and if you're one of those zealots who says, well, it ought to be Scrum and Scrum should be enough and that's it, that's great. But I haven't seen very many of those implementations be successful. And I've tried once or twice. And so it's not that it can't be done, it's just a very, very heavy lift. And there's the idea of trying to build it again. Maybe we just scaled it with the wrong framework. Maybe we weren't disciplined enough. Maybe we didn't have leadership on board. There are good examples of places that have adopted SAFe and really gone a long ways towards a very successful implementation, and then for reasons that had nothing to do with the framework, abandoned it. And then they come back years later and say, golly, I wonder how we do this scaling thing. And it's hard not to look at them and say, well, you had it right in front of you the whole time. The implementation was always there. You've just decided for one reason or another that you don't want to go there. But that doesn't mean the answer is still not staring you in the face. And I do think that there are some companies that waste an awful lot of time trying to customize it for themselves, when in fact a perfectly reasonable answer is staring them straight in the face in many of the existing frameworks. Now, I'm going to propose one other idea here, and this is Tom being a little bit of a radical. But let me ask you this. If somebody came along and said, we have an old application, let's say it's an insurance company, and this application was originally written in COBOL on a mainframe, and we know that that's not the future, and we'd like to get away from that. If they looked at you and said, we want to rewrite the whole thing from scratch, what would you tell them?
Too expensive.
Too expensive, right? Is there anybody who would jump on board and say, yeah, a rewrite sounds like a good idea?
I think it depends on how much they're willing to spend, what their tolerance is, right?
Right.
Companies knock down entire buildings and rebuild from scratch, and people knock down houses and rebuild from scratch. So know what you're getting in for.
Right. So the thing that I wonder about, and there are actually some patterns for how to tackle these sorts of rewrites, and most of them are, look, you compartmentalize the legacy portion of the system using something like the strangler pattern to basically partition off the old portion of the system. So when you're re-architecting, you use an API to communicate with the old system, and you develop the new system using new technology and new structures. Well, the point that I'm trying to make here is that why don't we do that with the personnel organization as well? Rather than trying to take the old organization, the old hierarchy, and rewrite that, which oftentimes is exactly what we do. We walk in and say, we're going to hit everyone over the head with a magic wand and make them into a bunch of mob programming fiends overnight. And look, you can do that in some places, but not very many. The fact of the matter is, most people are going to look at you like you're nuts, because they've been working within this culture and this environment for a long time. So rather than trying to turn them into something they're not, start something new, start something original, compartmentalize off the old organization, and start a new organization around a new business, maybe a peripheral business, something that you want to expand into, and grow that business. Take advantage of the fact that you have a greenfield organization using new technology and new structures, new ways of working together in a new company, rather than trying to make the old company conform or become something it really isn't. These old hierarchies, as we all know, do not gracefully change. And so rather than trying to give them new labels, maybe call everyone a scrum master, or, make changes, call people product owners and everything's going to change, that doesn't work. Fundamentally, these people are doing the same jobs they were before. They're not changing. And so what we need to do is start a new company. So that's Tom's wacky idea for the week, is that we need to treat this the same way we would a legacy architecture. And with a legacy architecture, most of the time, we would never, ever try and rewrite it. Instead, we would compartmentalize it, and then we would start new components with new technology, with new pieces and new parts, and we would leave the old cash cow alone.
Well, the Mick Kirsten has the book Project to Product.
Uh-huh.
That they took a lot of that stuff into SAFe, and he talks about that dual operating system.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And
yeah.
And I'm definitely look, I'm not a big believer in the dual operating system. I understand it and I appreciate it for what they're trying to do, but you don't actually get a dual operating system. I mean, it's a great idea in theory, but people just don't change their behavior. So it's kind of like, painting lipstick on a pig. Oh, it's it really, you've colored things. You've said, okay, now everybody has new roles and new job descriptions, and you're operating with the dual operating system. But when you step back and look at what they're actually doing, all too often, it's not a dual operating system. It's the same old. It's the same old one you had before. And that's not me criticizing the framework. That's me saying there's human nature involved.
Sure. Yeah.
People aren't going to do things dramatically different because it's just not how they're wired.
Yeah.
And so I do believe there are probably places where that dual operating system model probably can work, but I think it's actually a little bit pie in the sky and probably doesn't happen very often.
Worked great in the Unicorn Project book.
Right. It always works great in the books. I love Patrick Lencioni. I love reading his books because we always win in the end.
Yeah.
So, and same for the Gene Kim books.
Disney
yeah.
consultant. Yeah.
Yeah. I'd love to be that guy. But yeah, they're just books. They're fiction. So anyway, yeah, totally, and I don't want to pretend like I have the answer. It's just that my gut is telling me that the dual operating system is a nice abstraction. I understand what they're getting at, but I'm not a big believer in it. I don't know. I don't see that actually happening. And certainly not in the big organizations. And I'm thinking of like, a USAA, for example. This is an organization that has 30,000, 40,000, 50,000 people in it. And boy, that kind of institution does not change easy. Next up, where we go from here. I'm wondering, there's been talk over the years about Agile 1.0, Agile 2.0, and Lord knows there's been SAFe 5.0, and I'm sure there will be a SAFe 6.0 next year. But I'm not sure that's the evolution we're looking for. So I think that we have seen, and I've even criticized some organizations for going through this cycle of transformation and then resetting and retransformation and further resets and further retransformation. And it occurred to me that as we start to talk more and more about this thing called business agility, that's ongoing transformation. In other words, you're just signing up for transformation as an ongoing activity. You might as well give yourself a, chief transformation officer, and their job is going to be constantly managing the transformation of the organization on an ongoing basis from now on. As each new disruption comes down the pipe, they're going to be working. Their job is going to be continuously transforming. And it could be that that's a transformation that affects some divisions in the organization more dramatically than others. But really, if it's an organization that's able to adapt to its environment, then it's actually going to be a nonstop transformation. And so that may have to start with personal transformation at the leadership level. And yeah, maybe that's job security. Maybe that's the best possible outcome for guys like us, is some sort of notion of that continuous transformation. But I think it's much more likely, as we put increasing pressure on ourselves and on our customers, to create organizations that are constantly evolving. So that is really all I had to say on that topic. Any additional things you guys would like to add to that? Concerns, questions?
I'm actually wondering if we need to start moving away from this notion of agile and just do improvement of some sort.
Right.
And
right.
Yes, our toolbox is full of things like lean,
Mm-hmm.
maybe some agile, maybe some DevOps, maybe some service design.
Mm-hmm.
We've got this very rich toolbox, but stop calling it agile, because I have a feeling it's becoming a four-letter word.
Yeah. Well, I think, it's harder, and it may be wise as a consultant, when you go into an organization that has already done one or more agile transformations, and I'm using air quotes now, it might be smart not to use the word agile. It might be smart to use the word adaptive or some other term, or not, try and avoid the lingo at all. As one executive put it to me a few months ago, he said, I would really prefer it if you would not brand the transformation. Branding the transformation just turns it into yet another buzzword. And so I would prefer it if it's just how we work. And I'd like to focus on how we work. And I thought that was a magnificent way of looking at the challenge. Because otherwise it became just yet another of a million different change initiatives that organization was going through. And it almost became trite immediately.
And becomes a bit of a commodity as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so now it's hard to avoid that branding when you start trying to pitch it to other people and talk about it to other people. So it's a bit of a catch-22, but I knew what he was talking about, and it made a lot of sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that too.
Yeah. So if you're interested in seeing more stuff like this, please check out my website. I've really changed to really focusing on innovation and creativity. And so I think right now, with a lot of businesses shut down, with a lot of people out of work, what I can do best for my community right now is help them find new ways of working and new ideas for business. And so I've started working with companies simply on coming up with a diverse set of new ways that they can be doing business. And that also applies to products, and it also applies to people's careers. There are a lot of people who are out of work right now whose jobs have suddenly vanished. And so I want to help those folks get back on their feet. And that, at its heart, is an exercise in innovating your own career, in coming up with new ideas for how you can earn a living. That blends in well with my existing services, which are focused on training and coaching. And so please check out the website. And I've got lots of content up there. There is a YouTube channel that has videos from these webinars. In addition, I have a pretty good sized blog. It's got about 400 articles in it on Agile and Agile related topics. And again, I want to leave you with this thought. I'm looking for an opportunity to help build something great. And so if you're a business, I want to help you diversify. If you're a coach, I want to work with you to build new connections and help others thrive. And if you're unemployed, I want to help find you a new way of working. Those are the things I think that can, how I can contribute the best right now. And so thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your insights, and please stay in touch.